With the recent release of the interim report for the crash of Air India Flight 171, there has been speculation as to whether the crash was a deliberate act. I won't speculate on this case in this video, but I was interested in taking a closer look at the few occasions in which aircraft have crashed due to the deliberate actions of a pilot. In order to get a list of cases, I used ASN's list of plane crashes caused by suicide, bolstered by Wikipedia's list. I also added a case which was not mentioned on either of these lists, but appears relevant to the subject. To make the list more focused, I have excluded any occurrences that involve general aviation or illegal flights. This list will focus solely on aircraft which crashed or may have crashed due to pilot action while on a regular flight. I've organized these cases into 5 categories. The confirmed category covers cases which are widely accepted as a case of pilot suicide with clear evidence and no serious disputes over the cause. The not credibly disputed category covers situations where pilot suicide is disputed, but clear evidence and/or political motives call the dispute's credibility into question. The likely category covers cases where pilot suicide is not confirmed, but appears to be one of, if not the, most likely possibility. The disputed category covers cases where pilot suicide is blamed or suspected, but credible and well-reasoned doubt exists regarding the possibility, or there is a lack of proof put forward by authorities. Lastly, the credible category covers cases where a cause was not determined or insufficient information exists, but pilot suicide is a possible cause. On April 3rd of 1980, a Boeing 707 belonging to Biman Bangladesh Airlines was scheduled to perform a flight from Singapore's Paya Lebar Airport to Dhaka. The plane would take off from Singapore with 71 passengers and 7 crew. About 100 feet off the ground, all 4 engines lost power. The pilots made a forced landing at the airport. All 78 on board would survive. There is very little information on this case, and no explanation is given for the loss of all 4 engines. An aborted takeoff was suggested, but doesn't make any sense. A more interesting revelation would occur the following day, when Singaporean officials reported that the flight engineer had jumped from his hotel room to his death. The flight engineer would have been able to cut off fuel to the engines. No better explanation is provided, but due to the lack of information, I can't put it any higher than credible. Given recent events, I'm surprised this case hasn't received any more attention. On February 9, 1982, Japan Airlines Flight 350 left Fukuoka for Tokyo Haneda Airport with 174 on board. This flight was operated by a DC-8 with 3 flight crew, this being Captain Seiji Katagiri, First Officer Yoshifumi Ishikawa, and Flight Engineer Yoshimi Ozaki. Captain Katagiri had been on leave for a year between 1980 and 1981 due to mental issues. He returned to duty in November. He had reportedly behaved strangely during the flight to Tokyo, though I couldn't confirm this. The descent into Tokyo continued normally. During final approach to runway 33 right, First Officer Ishikawa made the 500 feet call-out. Captain Katagiri did not make the required call-out in response. Shortly after passing through the decision height, Katagiri disabled the autopilot, brought the engines back to idle, and pushed the nose down. First Officer Ishikawa attempted to save the aircraft, but the plane was too low to be recovered. The plane crashed into Tokyo Bay, killing 24 passengers. Captain Katagiri survived and took off his uniform. He was one of the first to be rescued, claiming to be an office worker. Katagiri was later arrested and charged. It was determined that he had been suffering from schizophrenia, and this had caused him to crash the plane. He was found not guilty due to insanity and was sent into psychiatric care. Katagiri was apparently released sometime prior to 2015. On August 21, 1994, Royal Air Maroc Flight 630 departed Agadir for Casablanca in Morocco with 44 on board. Flight was performed by an ATR-42. 10 minutes after takeoff, while climbing through 16,000 feet, the aircraft entered a steep dive. Flight 630 crashed about 30 kilometers northeast of the airport, killing all on board. By the 25th, Moroccan authorities had announced that the crash was caused by the captain. Specific details are not provided, though it was reported that the first officer made a distress call prior to impact. The text of this message seemed to imply some action by the captain, but no confirmation was provided. Shortly afterwards, a union representing Moroccan pilots challenged the findings. The union claimed that the captain had reported a technical issue prior to takeoff. The union requested to be involved in the investigation, but were refused. There is a disappointing lack of information regarding this case. No report appears to have ever been released to the public. The conclusion of pilot suicide appears to have taken less than 4 days. Considering the time needed to find the wreck, reach it, locate evidence in the black boxes, and analyze everything, this seems rather quick, but not unbelievable. The captain was reportedly depressed due to unspecified issues with his love life. The claim of technical difficulties by the union was not substantiated or expanded upon by them. Due to the sheer lack of information regarding this case, I will have to leave this one as disputed, since there's just nothing to go on without a report or any sort of serious reporting on it. On January 15th of 1995, a Swearingen Metroliner was performing a postal flight from Neuquén to Buenos Aires in Argentina. 3 were on board, this being the 2 pilots and someone described as an observer passenger. This observer was likely sitting in the cabin. Shortly after takeoff, the first officer left the cockpit. His reason for doing so is unclear. ASN says to check the cargo. An Argentinian historical blog says it was to close an emergency escape that had come open. In the ASN narrative, he was seen by the observer to open the aft cargo door and jump out of the aircraft. In the blog's narrative, the first officer fell out while trying to close the escape hatch. While ASN is typically more reliable, the entry is quite short and doesn't provide any sufficient source for me to look for. The blog appears to partially base its info on newspaper reporting from the time, which includes a photograph pointing to the emergency exit, which seems to confirm the blog's narrative. Despite search efforts, the co-pilot's body was apparently never found. I enlist this one no higher than credible due to the lack of information and competing narratives. On December 19th of 1997, SilkAir Flight 185 was traveling from Jakarta, Indonesia to Singapore with 104 on board. The 737-300 was flown by Singaporean captain Su Wei Ming and First Officer Duncan Ward of New Zealand. The pilots took a shortcut while flying over South Sumatra. According to the cockpit voice reporter, nothing unusual was occurring prior to 4 in the afternoon, a bit more than 20 minutes after takeoff. While First Officer Ward ate a meal, Captain Ming got out of his seat and exited the cockpit. Captain Ming offered to get the first officer some water as he left his seat. Ward declined this offer, and this was the last thing recorded on the CVR, which shut off as Captain Ming got out of his seat at 4:05. At 4:10, one of the pilots acknowledged a communication from ATC. It's believed that this acknowledgement was made by First Officer Ward. Nothing unusual was noted at this time. At 4:11, the flight data recorder ceased to function as well. The plane continued to fly normally until 4:12 when radar detected the aircraft beginning a rapid descent. Flight 185 crashed into the Musi River a minute later, killing all on board. Both the NTSC of Indonesia and the NTSB of the United States would investigate the crash. The investigators struggled to find a cause for the CVR and FDR shutting off prior to impact. The plane encountered no apparent issue prior to 4:12, yet the recorders ceased to function separately prior to this point. Tests in a 737 were only able to recreate these failures by deliberately pulling the circuit breakers for the recorders. The circuit breakers were located behind the captain's seat. Despite the lack of FDR data, the radar recordings allowed investigators to try and recreate the crash sequence. Tests in a flight simulator found that the only way to reproduce the final minute of the flight was by deliberate and continuous nose-down commands by a pilot. No mechanical failure or other accidental cause could account for any of these facts. First Officer Ward was initially viewed with suspicion, but there was no indication that he had any motive to crash the plane deliberately. Investigations of Captain Ming, however, produced a number of red flags. Prior to joining SilkAir, Captain Ming served in the Royal Singapore Air Force. Ming had been involved in 3 traumatic events during his service. In September of 1981, he was involved in a training accident. A junior pilot he was training was killed, though Ming was found not to be at fault. In March of 1986, Ming was forced to eject from an aircraft due to mechanical issues. He was again found to not be at fault. Most interesting of all was the first case. Ming was one of 4 pilots assigned to perform a training mission. A technical problem forced Ming to abandon the mission and return to base. Later in the flight, the other 3 pilots would crash into a mountain, killing them all. This event occurred on December 19, 1979, exactly 18 years before the crash. Captain Ming would leave the Air Force and join SilkAir in 1992. His service at SilkAir was not spotless. Though he quickly climbed through the ranks after joining in 1992 to become captain and a line instructor pilot, he had been demoted to a regular captain after an incident in June of 1997. He had pulled and reset a CVR circuit breaker before flight, which was forbidden. Ming was upset about his demotion. On December 10th, he had spoken to other pilots about other plane crashes while on another flight. Among the cases mentioned was one in which a Boeing 737 was hijacked and crashed in Malaysia. Ming was told by another pilot that the CVR had been recovered and had assisted investigators in determining what had happened. Ming had also been involved in high-risk stock trading. By 1997, things were going poorly for Ming, with him making net losses. In November, Ming had taken out a mortgage insurance policy, which would provide money to his family in case of his death. This policy became active on December 19th, the date of the crash. He had also racked up substantial credit card debt. A significant portion of this debt was supposed to be paid Ming once he returned home to Singapore on December 19th. Combined, these factors point to the aircraft being deliberately crashed by Captain Ming. A possible scenario goes as follows. When Captain Ming got out of his seat at 4:05, he pulled the CVR circuit breaker. His body and the sound of him getting out of his seat prevented Ward from seeing or hearing this. He returned to the cockpit sometime before 4:11. Ming concocted some excuse to get Ward out of the cockpit, and once he was alone, he locked the cockpit door and pulled the FDR circuit breaker at 4:11. He needed to pull the circuit breaker at this point as it would trigger an alarm. A minute later, he would put the plane into a dive. The cause of the crash was disputed. The NTSB favored the pilot suicide theory. The NTSC, however, did not agree with this conclusion. They instead pointed to previous issues with the Boeing 737's rudder PCU. This device controlled the rudder's movement. In 1991, United Airlines Flight 585 crashed near Colorado Springs due to a rudder hardover. In 1994, US Air Flight 427 crashed near Pittsburgh for the same reason. Multiple non-fatal incidents occurred as well. These had all been caused by malfunctions of the rudder PCU. However, by 1997, these issues were well known and had been fixed. The accident aircraft was less than a year old, meaning that these issues had already been fixed by the time it had rolled off the assembly line. Inspections of the PCU on board Flight 185 and another similar SilkAir 737 found no evidence of a hardover or the necessary conditions to cause it. The NTSC could not provide any explanation for the flight recorders being disabled 6 minutes apart during level flight. The NTSC acknowledged the concerns about Captain Ming. The report concluded that no evidence could be found for what caused the crash. The NTSB would respond to this report with a letter criticizing the NTSC's conclusion. This letter was included in and responded to by the NTSC. The NTSB would point out numerous issues with the report. The report generally downplayed or ignored evidence of pilot suicide. The fact that the only way to reproduce the separate failure of recorders was by deliberately switching them off was ignored. Emphasis was put on the PCU theory despite the lack of evidence. The NTSC's response is quite dismissive. Entire paragraphs of the NTSB's letter are responded to, with 1 to 2 sentences that dismiss the criticism without responding to it. For some comparison, another letter was sent to the NTSC from Singapore's Ministry of Communications and Information Technology. This letter did not focus on the issue of pilot suicide, instead simply suggesting various minor corrections and clarifications. There were 7 amendments made to the report based on the 6-page MCIT letter, whereas only 1 amendment was made based on the 49-page NTSB letter. This amendment was minor, simply modifying the text of a sentence discussing emergency descent procedures. The NTSB's recommendation to change the findings and conclusions to acknowledge the likelihood of pilot suicide was rejected. The NTSC's response to the NTSB claimed that there was no evidence to positively conclude that the departure from cruise flight was an intentional maneuver. This ignores all prior evidence to the contrary. One final nail in the coffin for the NTSC's theory comes from Season 12, Episode 4 of the television series Mayday. This episode focused on Flight 185. Santoso Sayogo, an NTSC investigator involved in the case, was interviewed for this episode. He claimed that the report had originally concluded the crash to be caused by pilot suicide, but had been rejected by his superiors. It was subsequently modified to declare the cause to be unknown. Reading the report myself, this seems to match with Sayogo's claim. It reads like it was originally pointing towards pilot suicide, only to be quickly modified to declare the cause unknown. Large parts of the report only make sense if the possibility of pilot suicide was considered. If it was properly considered, the clear evidence for pilot suicide and against any other cause should have resulted in a conclusion similar to the NTSB's. The fact that no cause was determined thus only makes sense if someone did not like the logical conclusion of the available evidence. Thus, I'm listing this case as not credibly disputed, as there is overwhelming evidence in favor of pilot suicide that the disputing party has failed to explain or respond to in good faith. On October 30th, 1999, EgyptAir Flight 990 left Los Angeles for a flight to Cairo with a stopover in New York. The flight was performed by a Boeing 767-300. The flight to New York was uneventful. The leg to Cairo would be performed by 2 flight crews, each consisting of a captain and first officer. One flight crew, consisting of Captain Ahmed El-Habashi and First Officer Adel Anwar, would fly the plane for the first part of the flight. The relief crew would take over later on. This crew consisted of Relief Captain Rauf Noor El-Din and Relief First Officer Gamil El-Batouti. Also on board was Captain Hatem Rushdie, EgyptAir's Chief of 767 Operations. Flight 990 left New York around 1:20 in the morning of October 31st. It was expected that the main crew would perform the first few hours of the flight. 20 minutes after takeoff, Relief First Officer Al-Batouti requested to take over from First Officer Anwar. Al-Batouti was very insistent and convinced First Officer Anwar to switch with him. Al-Batouti replaced Anwar at 1:42. The plane continued to follow normal flight. At 1:47, Captain El-Habashi acknowledged a frequency change direction from ATC and reported on the new frequency. At 1:48, Captain El-Habashi left the cockpit to use the lavatory, leaving Relief First Officer Al-Batouti alone in the cockpit. 11 seconds after El-Habashi left the cockpit, Al-Batouti began muttering to himself. 10 seconds later, he quietly said, quote, "I rely on God," in Arabic. Nothing recorded on the CVR or FDR indicated anything unusual that might have prompted any sort of response from him. Shortly before 1:50, the plane began to pitch down. The autopilot disconnected without producing an alert, indicating that it was disabled intentionally. The throttles were moved back to idle. Al-Batouti kept repeating the words, "I rely on God." At 1:50, Captain El-Habashi returned to the cockpit, demanding to know what was happening. Al-Batouti did not respond to the captain. Shortly after El-Habashi returned to his seat, the descent began to decrease. At this point, the positions of the left and right elevators began to change. A feature of the Boeing 767 was the ability for pilots to independently move the elevators. The left elevator was controlled by the captain, while the right was controlled by the first officer. The left elevator was moved to the nose-up position, while the right moved nose-down. Within 20 seconds of the captain's return, the engine start levers were moved to the cut-off positions, shutting down the engines. The captain asked why Al-Batouti had shut down the engines and received no response. El-Habashi told Al-Batouti to pull with him, referring to the control column. FDR and CVR recordings ended at this point. Radar sites on the coast recorded the aircraft stopped descending around this time. The aircraft climbed to 25,000 feet before diving again. The plane broke apart and crashed into the Atlantic Ocean, killing all 217 people on board. The investigation into the crash was led by the NTSB. Gamil al-Batouti was 59 years old at the time of the crash. He had previously served in the Egyptian Air Force during the Six-Day and Yom Kippur Wars. Pilots in Egypt were forced to retire at the age of 60. The 767's elevator system was scrutinized during the investigation. Concerns were raised regarding the elevator power control actuators. If two PCAs had failed in the right elevator, it might explain the crash, as this would cause an elevator hardover. If this had occurred in the right elevator, it might explain some of the events which had occurred. There were, however, some problems with the theory. The autopilot being manually disconnected prior to the start of the dive makes no sense. None of the first officer's actions make any sense in this theory. Closer examination and extensive testing of the theory demonstrated that such a failure could not reproduce the flight path recorded on the FDR or by radar. Other cases of control difficulties involving the elevator caused by this issue had occurred, but planes involved remained controllable and made safe landings. If such an event occurred, pilots would and should have been able to recover the aircraft. The loss of the recorders was caused by the shutdown of the engines. The NTSB considered al-Batouti's actions inconsistent with a pilot attempting to recover from a loss of control. It appeared as though al-Batouti was not trying to recover the aircraft, while Captain al-Habashi was trying to save the aircraft. It was concluded that al-Batouti had crashed the aircraft deliberately. The report did not refer to the crash as a murder or suicide, though this was the belief of the NTSB. This appears to have been done to reduce the impact on Egyptian-American relations and because criminal acts are out of the NTSB's wheelhouse. Egyptian authorities disputed the conclusion. The Egyptians instead argued that the crash was caused by the aforementioned elevator issues. For reasons previously discussed, this is unlikely. A few months after the crash, an EgyptAir pilot named Hamdi Taha sought asylum in the UK, claiming to have information on the case. When interviewed by American authorities, he explained that al-Batouti had previously been reported for sexual misconduct and indecent exposure while stationed at New York. Hatem Rushdie, the airline's chief 767 pilot, decided to remove him from the airline's US route. This had apparently occurred within hours of the flight. A few hours before the flight, al-Batouti had apparently given $35 to another EgyptAir pilot. He told the pilot to give the money to his son if anything happened to him. The US route was lucrative and prestigious as it allowed al-Batouti to buy American goods and sell them at a profit in Egypt. Flight 990 was his last flight on the route. Hatem Rushdie was also returning to Egypt on Flight 990. Overall, the evidence points to pilot suicide by Gamil al-Batouti. Actions such as setting the throttles to idle and then shutting off the engines during a dive make no sense unless the goal was to crash the plane. Proven details like this mean that the Egyptians' theory of elevator PCA malfunction is very unlikely. No crash of a 767 has ever been caused by elevator issues like those claimed by Egyptian authorities. The type overall has a very good safety record. At the time, Egypt was ruled by Hosni Mubarak, a former Air Force pilot just like al-Batouti. As such, pilots and especially Air Force pilots were viewed with great reverence in Egypt. Egypt has a bit of a history of covering up or shifting blame for crashes that potentially make the country or its government look bad. Examples include Flash Airlines Flight 604 and EgyptAir Flight 804. Flash Airlines Flight 604 crashed minutes after takeoff from Sharm el-Sheikh on January 3, 2004, killing all 148 on board. The captain was a former Air Force pilot. Egyptian investigators blamed mechanical issues. American and French investigators blamed pilot error, saying the crash was caused by spatial disorientation affecting the captain. The evidence for mechanical issues was pretty weak. EgyptAir Flight 804 crashed in the Mediterranean Sea on May 16th of 2016, killing all 66 people on board. Egyptian investigators determined that the aircraft was destroyed by a bomb. In contrast, French investigators determined that the crash was caused by an in-flight fire, possibly caused by a lit cigarette and a leak in the pilot oxygen system due to improper maintenance. In this case, evidence for a bombing was weak. Overall, the Egyptian criticism of the NTSB report does not hold water. Mechanical failure does not explain Al-Batuti's actions. Thus, I am putting this case in the not credibly disputed category. On November 29, 2013, LAM Flight 470 departed Maputo, Mozambique for Luanda, Angola, with 33 on board. The Embraer ERJ-190 was flown by Captain Herminio dos Santos Fernandez and First Officer Grecio Gregorio Chimuquil. The flight was normal until the plane reached Exedu, a reporting point along the route located in northern Botswana. The plane began a descent from 38,000 feet. No distress call was made. The plane continued to descend until it crashed in Namibia's Bwabwata National Park, killing all on board. According to the CVR, First Officer Chimuquil had left the cockpit to use the lavatory about 12 minutes before the crash. Captain Fernandez was left alone in the cockpit, despite LAM policy forbidding this. 3 minutes after the First Officer left the cockpit, a sound similar to the autopilot altitude selector being adjusted was heard on the CVR. The autopilot altitude setting was changed from 38,000 feet to 592 feet. The terrain in the region is well above 3,000 feet, meaning the setting would fly the aircraft into the ground. The plane subsequently began to descend. No response or action was heard from Captain Fernandez after the descent began. 6 minutes prior to impact, the First Officer returned to the cockpit and tried to open the door. The door was locked and Captain Fernandez did not unlock it. Knocking was heard periodically for the rest of the flight. Alarms were heard in the cockpit and were ignored by the captain. No evidence of medical issues could be found that explained the captain's actions. Investigation of Captain Fernandez's personal life revealed a few concerns. He was divorced from his wife, but the divorce process had been ongoing for nearly a decade. His youngest daughter was in poor health and had recently undergone heart surgery in South Africa. Perhaps most noteworthy, his son died in a car accident the previous year. This crash was a suspected suicide. Fernandez had not attended his son's funeral. His son died on November 21st of 2012, almost a year to the day before the crash of LAM Flight 470. Based on simulator testing and analysis of the wreckage, Namibian investigators determined that the only possible explanation for the crash was a deliberate action by Fernandez. It appears as though all investigating agencies involved in the case agreed with the Namibian report, including those from Mozambique, where the aircraft originated. A Mozambican pilots' union disputed the results, claiming that the captain had acted in accordance with emergency procedures set up by Embraer. I see no reason why Embraer's emergency procedures would call for a pilot to initiate a descent below ground level without any known emergency occurring while locking out the first officer. I was unable to find any more information on this dispute, but if this is the argument being made, I really don't think I need to. The evidence in the report speaks for itself, and I will be putting this case in the confirmed category. On March 8, 2014, Malaysian Airlines Flight 370 left Kuala Lumpur for Beijing with 239 people on board. The plane departed at 12:42 in the morning. The Boeing 777-200 was flown by Captain Zahari Ahmad Shah and First Officer Farik Abdul Hamid. The flight was normal until a routine handoff from ATC in Kuala Lumpur to controllers in Ho Chi Minh City at 1:19. The crew acknowledged this handoff, but did not contact Ho Chi Minh. A minute later, the aircraft's transponder shut off. Initial searches would focus on the last known position, but later investigation would produce a more confusing and concerning scenario. Malaysian military radar detected the aircraft flying back over Malaysia. When near the island of Penang, the plane turned and followed navigation points over the Strait of Malacca. The flight passed numerous suitable emergency landing areas and made no distress calls despite clearly being controllable. A hit was detected from a cell phone as the aircraft passed Penang, Captain Shaw's birthplace. This phone was determined to belong to the first officer. This indicated that he may have been trying to make a phone call from the aircraft. Analysis of ACAR's messages would suggest that the aircraft made a final turn south before flying for several hours and crashing into the Indian Ocean. The ACAR's messages indicated no issues with the aircraft. Wreckage that later washed up in Africa was confirmed to have come from the aircraft. This wreckage confirmed a crash site in the Indian Ocean, somewhere west of Australia. The main wreck of the aircraft has never been found. The movements of the aircraft after the last known contact indicate that at least one competent pilot was in control of the aircraft. The continued flight of the aircraft suggests that nothing catastrophic had occurred to it. Investigation of Captain Shaw's home flight simulator found 7 suspicious waypoints. When combined, they formed a flight path eerily similar to the latter part of the flight. Whether they came from the same file could not be determined. All 7 of these waypoints had been manually programmed by Shaw rather than being something included in the program itself. These were not sufficient to prove guilt due to a lack of important information. First Officer Hamid had recently been promoted to the Boeing 777. He only had 39 hours on the type and a total flying time of 2,813 hours. In contrast, Captain Shaw had nearly 8,600 hours on the 777 and over 18,400 hours in total. No unusual or concerning behavior was noted from either pilot. Based on numerous handshakes from the Aircraft Communications and Reporting System, or ACARS, it was determined that the aircraft had crashed sometime between 8:19 and 9:15 in the morning. Conclusive answers will not be found until the wreckage is. The final hours of the flight clearly point to an experienced pilot being in control of the aircraft. None of the passengers fit this description, and First Officer Hamid was inexperienced with the Boeing 777. Nothing suspicious was noted about Hamid. Thus, the only person who could be flying the aircraft in such a manner was Captain Shaw. Other theories, like an in-flight fire or accidental decompression of the aircraft, do not explain the flight path or lack of communication from the aircraft. An in-flight fire would have either given the crew enough time to make a distress call or else spread so quickly that it would have caused the plane to crash within minutes. If a loss of cabin pressure occurred, the pilots either could have successfully put on their oxygen masks or had failed to do so in time. In the former, they would have made a distress call, initiated an emergency descent, and likely made a safe landing. In the latter, they would have been incapacitated, and the aircraft would have continued along the programmed flight path until it ran out of fuel and crashed. The known facts of the case, that being that the aircraft had left its intended flight path, gone on a winding journey that coincidentally allowed the aircraft to evade detection from the ground until crashing west of Australia, does not fit any of these theories. Some sort of deliberate action was needed to produce this flight path. As previously mentioned, Shaw was the only one who could have done this. No evidence or motive could be found for Shaw to do this. Every other theory regarding this case, other than pilot suicide, either ignores significant amounts of evidence regarding suicide, or evolves into nonsensical conspiratorial drivel. That being said, the lack of confirmation for this theory due to the failure to find the wreckage means that I can put it no higher than the likely category. On March 24th, 2015, Germanwings Flight 9525 left Barcelona for Dusseldorf with 150 people on board. The Airbus A320 was flown by Captain Patrick Sondenheimer and First Officer Andreas Lubitz. The plane left at 10 a.m. local time, and the flight was ordinary until 10:30 a.m. At this point, the plane began to descend from its cruising altitude of 38,000 feet. No response was given to multiple communications from ATC. The descent continued until the plane crashed into a mountain in southeastern France at 10:41, killing all on board. Examination of CVR records would find that Captain Sondenheimer left the cockpit at 10:30, presumably to use the lavatory. First Officer Lubitz was left alone in the cockpit. At 10:31, the altitude setting was changed from 38,000 feet to 100 feet. Terrain in the region is well above 100 feet. Various adjustments to the speed setting were made until eventually being set to the maximum of 350 knots. At 10:34, Captain Sondenheimer attempted to re-enter the cockpit. Lubitz did not let him in. Captain Sondenheimer tried multiple times to re-enter the cockpit and eventually resorted to trying to break down the door. Lubitz made no attempt to save the aircraft. Investigation of Lubitz would reveal a history of mental illness. His medical certificate was not revalidated in 2009 due to depression and the use of antidepressants. His medical certificate was renewed a few months later. In December of 2014, he began exhibiting symptoms of a psychotic depressive episode. He began consulting multiple doctors. He was prescribed psychotropic medication, which made him unfit to fly. Some of the doctors he saw were likely aware of his profession, but did not inform Germanwings of his diagnoses. Some of the doctors he saw were likely aware of his profession, but did not inform Germanwings of his diagnosis. They were restricted in doing so due to medical confidentiality laws in Germany. It was expected that Lubitz would do so himself, but he did not inform his employer. Lubitz was apparently worried about vision loss and going blind, despite there being no evidence of him suffering vision loss. Lubitz may have also been concerned about the loss of income and lack of insurance if he was declared unfit to fly. No other explanation for the crash was found, thus I have classified it as confirmed. On April 13, 2015, Carson Air Flight 66 departed Vancouver for a series of cargo flights between small towns in northern British Columbia. Only 2 pilots were on board the square-engine Metroliner. The aircraft departed Vancouver at 7:03 in the morning. The plane was directed to fly in a northerly direction at 350 degrees and climb to 9,000 feet. At 7:08, the plane was cleared to climb to 20,000 feet. The crew acknowledged this clearance. The first officer was believed to be the one handling radio communications, meaning the captain was likely flying the aircraft. 1 minute and 20 seconds later, the airplane disappeared from secondary radar while climbing through 8,700 feet. It was still detected by primary radar. The plane began a steep descent while maintaining a heading of 350 degrees. By the time the aircraft reached 5,000 feet, it was descending at a rate of 30,000 feet per minute. Around this time, the aircraft broke apart in the air, and the plane would crash in mountainous terrain north of Vancouver, killing both pilots. The aircraft was not fitted with a CVR or FDR, as it was not required to by Canadian law. Weather was ruled out as a cause, and no technical issue could be found with the aircraft. The aircraft's elevator trim system was found in the full nose-down setting, which doesn't make any sense for a plane trying to recover from a dive. Evidence of metal fatigue was found on some parts, but was determined to have not caused the accident. No evidence of an in-flight fire was found. Focus shifted to the pilots. Both were wearing shoulder harnesses during the flight. These would have prevented either pilot from slumping over the controls if they were somehow incapacitated. No issues were found with the first officer's record. His autopsy revealed nothing unusual. The captain had been working for Carson Air since May of 2013. He was promoted to captain on December 5th of 2014. On December 11th, he was subjected to a performance review due to a complaint from another pilot. This pilot had reported that he had needed to take control of the aircraft from the captain due to an unspecified incident. He had passed this review. On March 3rd, 2015, he was issued a non-disciplinary letter after overfueling an aircraft and failing to report it. On March 20th of 2015, he applied for promotion to Carson Air's chief pilot at Vancouver. He was informed that he had not been selected on March 26th. The captain's autopsy produced concerning results. It was determined that the captain was an alcoholic, with his body exhibiting clear signs of prolonged excessive alcohol usage. It was also determined that he was under the effects of alcohol during the final flight. Other employees had been suspicious of the captain. At least one employee had smelled alcohol in his breath. No immediate action was taken, as a supervisor could not smell anything. It had been decided to monitor the captain instead. The level of alcohol in the captain's system at the time of his death was consistent with 14 to 20 standard drinks, depending on how long it had been since he had consumed alcohol. The captain had behaved normally prior to the flight. Alcoholics have a greater tolerance for alcohol, explaining why his inebriation was not detected. The captain lived alone and had no known social life. This increased the already well-established tendency towards suicide by alcoholics. An increased frequency in suicide after a major news event involving suicide had also been noted. The crash of Germanwings Flight 9525 occurred 20 days before Carson Air Flight 66 crashed. By this point in the Germanwings investigation, pilot suicide was publicly known to be the most likely cause. The Transportation Safety Board of Canada considered 3 possible scenarios. First, the possibility of a pitot tube blockage was considered. Icing conditions existed at the time of the flight. If the pitot heating system was not used, this could have caused erroneous reading. The crew may have then attempted to descend while in cloud, but descended too steeply, causing the crash. The captain's drunkenness and first officer's limited experience on the type made a possible failure to use the pitot heat credible. There are some issues with this, however, as the steep and sudden descent should have been immediately apparent to the pilots. In addition to this, no attempt to save the aircraft was made, despite this being possible for the crew to do. The second scenario considered was pilot incapacitation. No evidence of an issue that could have incapacitated both pilots was found, and no evidence of an issue that could cause the first officer's incapacitation was found. Thus, only the captain's incapacitation was considered plausible. The first officer should have been able to save the aircraft in such a scenario. The final scenario considered was suicide by the captain. The lack of technical or environmental issues, full nose-down trim setting, descent in the direction of flight, lack of emergency communications, and the failure to attempt any recovery made this theory credible. No explanation was found for how the captain was able to crash the plane without being stopped by the first officer. As indicated by the crash of Royal Air Maroc Flight 630, this was still possible. This theory could not be confirmed due to the lack of survivors or recorders. Pilot suicide is still the best explanation for the crash. Whatever did cause the crash, the captain's intoxication certainly played a role. As this case was not definitively determined to be caused by pilot suicide, I will put it in the likely category. On March 21st, 2022, China Eastern Airlines Flight 5735 departed Kunming for Guangzhou with 132 people on board. The Boeing 737-800 departed Kunming at 1:16 Beijing time. The flight was normal until around 2:20. Controllers saw the aircraft enter a rapid descent. The plane crashed in hilly terrain around 250 kilometers west of Guangzhou, killing all on board. A document released by the Civil Aviation Administration of China on April 20th indicated that no issues had been found with the crew, aircraft, weather, or cargo. The CAAC was subsequently very quiet during the subsequent investigation. On March 20th, 2023, the CAAC issued a very short interim statement. The statement described the crash as being, quote, very complicated and extremely rare. The NTSB was also involved in the investigation, though ultimately the CAAC was in charge. They were apparently satisfied with the investigation so far. A similar statement was issued in 2024. Absolutely nothing was released in 2025. In May of 2025, the CAAC stated that it would release an interim investigation report despite being required to do so. This was due to concerns that the report would, in its own words, quote, endanger national security and societal stability, end quote. Why might this be? Well, for obvious reasons, Chinese media has not discussed any of the controversies or allegations regarding the case, except perhaps criticize them. Western media has been a bit more forthcoming when it comes to discussing these allegations. On May 17th, 2022, the Wall Street Journal reported that data from the black boxes indicated a deliberate crash. This reportedly came from somebody involved in the NTSB investigation. No issues had been found with the aircraft. The Wall Street Journal claimed that the NTSB was investigating the possibility of pilot suicide or interference by a passenger. The issues that plagued the 737 MAX aircraft could be immediately ruled out due to the accident aircraft being a 737-800. Researching this case has been rather difficult, though it must be said the behavior of the Chinese authorities is odd, specifically the decision to not release the report as it would, quote, endanger national security and societal stability, end quote. Any flaw or failure in the American-designed and built 737 wouldn't cause China to block the report. Nothing indicated an issue with China Eastern Airlines or its procedures. The airline appears to have a good safety record, with the last fatal accident involving the airline occurring in 1993. Combined, this points to a scenario which would make the Chinese government look bad or cause significant unrest among the Chinese population. When remembering the reporting from the Wall Street Journal that indicated a deliberate act by someone on board the aircraft, this points towards pilot suicide. As we have seen with SilkAir Flight 185 and EgyptAir Flight 990, governments have been quite willing to conceal pilot suicides in the past. A pilot suicide would explain the Chinese government's reluctance to release the report. There have been allegations regarding certain members of the flight crew, though I was unable to find any more detailed information that came from any sort of reliable source. Ultimately, reliable information in general is rather sparse on this case. However, the behavior of the Chinese government, media reports, and general facts of the case point to pilot suicide, though the lack of information prevents me from putting it any higher than the likely category. As I said at the beginning, I will refrain from speculating on the case of Air India Flight 171, though I suspect that the cases of the Biman Bangladesh 707 in Singapore and EgyptAir Flight 990 may be of some interest due to certain similarities. The whole subject is quite dark, and hopefully the investigation into the case will be performed properly. As we've seen, this is by no means guaranteed should pilot suicide be the cause. I was working on another video when the preliminary report was released, and I will get back to working on the video once I have this one out. I won't ask if you enjoyed this video, but I hope you stick around for that, and until then, I wish you a good day.